Hey guys, Kyle here with Gnarly Knives, and I want to do a video today talking a little bit about sharpening. I want to have a discussion talking about some of my experiences. Maybe you guys can learn from some of my mistakes, and also just a few tips and tricks for some people who are getting into sharpening. This is not going to be a tutorial per se. I have a couple videos where it's just more or less me sharpening and kind of talking a little bit about it. But I do actually in the very near future want to do a full sharpening tutorial from start to finish, going through the stones and discussing everything that I do in my process, going through all of that. This here is going to be, like I said, discussing some mistakes that I've made, things that I've learned from, talking a little bit about minorly just some of my techniques and just kind of like I said, some tips and tricks. So this is going to be more for people who are new to sharpening, but have maybe already began sharpening. If you've never sharpened before, but you want to get into it, I mean, give you some good advice in that sense to get you going there. But it might be more helpful for people that already know a little bit of the basics and just kind of going into it from there. So what I first want to start out with saying is, when I first started, there were a lot of videos online, and I got really caught up in, the best way I can kind of put it is, I remember my father saying when I was a kid, if you ask 10 different people the same question, you get 10 different answers, and I feel like sharpening is no different. Everybody has their own methods, they have their own ways of doing it, so what I'm going to talk about, and in my other videos where I show myself sharpening, or in future tutorials, this is just how I do it. You will, on your own, develop your certain techniques that you like to use, what work best for you. But with me personally, I got really caught up in, there's a specific way to do it. I started getting caught up in, certain angles, and I overwhelmed myself. And sharpening is something I think can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. Of course, there is a lot that goes with it. There are a lot of things to consider, but it doesn't need to be as complicated as it seems. Before I started sharpening, especially freehand sharpening, to me it just seemed like it was just magic and sorcery. I'd watch videos of people taking a completely dull knife or just reprofiling a knife, and then by the end of the video it's shaving hair, it's whittling strands of hair and everything, shaving paper, and it'd just be like, what sorcery is this? And it's not quite as complicated as it seems, though I guess at the same time it can be, depending on what it is you're going for. But this is what my goal with this here is more for, you want a good edge, you want to be able to maintain your knives, without really going into, I know I've kind of discussed a little bit in other videos about getting into mirror polishes and stuff like that. Don't really need that for most people. I'll be honest, for me, the only reason I really do mirror polishes on some of my knives, just I think they look really cool, and it's a way to kind of show off a little bit. But a knife doesn't have to have, a 5, 6, 10,000 grit edge in order to be sharp or shave hair. It just looks really cool. Yeah, it'll be, much more polished. It'll, kind of a little bit cut better, but it's really just more of a flexing. It's kind of just how I see it. Look what I can do. Of course, there is more to it than that, but generally speaking, I feel like for the average person or average user, you just want to get a good edge, and you want to be able to replicate that. So what I would say, honestly, if you really are getting into sharpening, I would really focus on maintaining or sticking with factory edges just off the bat. Then you can, once you get good at that, then yeah, if you really want to go to town and changing angles, and once I started getting good with that, I started experimenting, what angles work better, and there are pros and cons, there are benefits to both. But what I would really recommend if you're first starting to sharpen is I would start with cheaper stones and sharpening cheaper knives. And the reasons I say that is, for number one, if it's something you want to try out, you don't know if you're going to really get into it, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't recommend going and dropping tons of money on a bunch of stones, then they're just going to wind up being paperweights. The same with the knives. Even if you have higher end knives, if you really are very new at like freehand sharpening, you don't want to ruin those knives. I have done so, and I will get into it a bit. I touched on it a little bit with my Falkneven S1 review from yesterday. I basically just destroyed the knife, but I was able to fix it. Actually, the other day I finally got back to it, but I will get into that a little bit further in the video. But the very first stone that I bought, and it was actually before I really thought about getting hardcore into sharpening. What it was an $8 stone I picked up at Walmart, and it's one of my favorite stones. This stone has a lot of use. This thing is my workhorse. But it is a Smith's I believe it's a 100 and a 220. Now, Smith's, the brand I would say I would recommend. A stone with decent lower grit is good for if you are trying to reprofile, but also if you have significant damage to the knife, if you have chips, rolls, anything like that. You can remove a lot of material, which is a good thing, but also can be a bad thing. You can remove more than you are intending. But this was the first stone I got, and I had really kind of messed around with it. What I like about it is it's lasted. It is starting to wear quite a bit, and I'll get another one. Like I said, it's $8, and I absolutely love this stone. This is probably one of my favorite stones, and it's one of the cheaper of my stones. It's just keeps going and going, and I've, no kidding, probably sharpened 70, 80 plus knives. Like, this thing has been used, if not more. It's just, this is such a great way to go. But this is also the stone, like I said, I ruined my Falkneven on, because I was not quite new to sharpening freehand in general, but I had never really done anything with convex edges, and that's where I kind of screwed myself. I got really caught up in all the videos, and I just took it to a whole new extreme. And basically, just the simple, most knives that you're going to come across are just going to have your V edges, so it just means it's a straight line from where the edge begins up to the apex. The apex is just, I don't know if you will, the tippity tip of the edge, what's really doing the main cutting. So instead of a V edge, a convex is more of a rounded off edge, which does have its benefits. It puts more material behind the edge, so it makes it a lot sturdier, which is good. But you have to sharpen a little differently, So when if I'm doing regular sharpening, you want to kind of maintain a set angle, and a lot of it does become muscle memory. You want to just be able to keep your hand or your blade at a certain position in doing your sharpening. But with convex, you're trying to sharpen a couple of parts leading up to the apex. So you're kind of doing a little bit of now this isn't exaggerated, and this is where I kind of screwed myself. But you're essentially just doing minor twists with the positions of the blade in order to apex and keep that rounded edge. Now, like I said, I got caught up into it. I saw people doing so it looks like, they're really doing these huge twists with their positions. They keep altering the position, and I literally just rounded over the edge. There was no apex. I literally had a rounded edge. You could cut and cut on yourself. You're not doing anything. It was literally a completely rounded over edge. And I tried a few times at first to fix it. I ended up setting the knife aside for probably 6 months. I just felt very defeated, and at a point I was considering just buying a new one, but then I was thinking, well, what am I going to do when it needs to be sharpened? Am I just going to have a box of ruined Falknevens or ruined convex knives? Because to me, it's just, I felt very ashamed and embarrassed, because I was like, wow, I had gotten pretty decent with the regular, V-edge knives. And what's funny is that, according to a lot of people that sharpen, the convex is supposedly the oldest method of sharpening, and is supposed to be easiest. Now, granted, unless you're using those angle-guided systems, there's always going to be a little bit of human error. You're going to have, you're always going to have, ever so slight even of a convex. Now, that was just something I did not understand at the time. I took it as, well, I have to really, sharpen and pull back and just do all these motions. And that's how I ended up ruining the edge. And I completely ruined the bevel. There was no apex, and I had just a rounded edge. Tried to fix it, thinking, all right, well, I'm better with V edges, so I'll put a V edge on it. But there was the thickness behind what would have been or should have been the edge was so thick. Tried to put a V edge on it, and what I ended up doing was just putting this huge, gnarly, it was an apex. There was a little bit of an apex there, and it would not cut. It was not sharp. Set the knife aside again, probably a few more months, and then one day it was like, I didn't really have anything to do. It was like, you know what, I'm going to try and fix this. And over the course of a few sharpenings, over the course of a couple months, I just kept working on it. Watched a few more videos, but also reflected on what I watched and went off of my experience with ruining this knife, that I just need to keep working at it. And like I said, after, the first time I did it, I removed the V and I had a little bit more of a convex, but it was still very, I would say it technically had an apex. So probably about a month after that, did it again. It was a little more, same thing. And then about a week ago, because this knife, honestly, I ruined it probably about a year and a half ago, and I just last week finally sat down and fixed it. Now, I had gotten a few other convex knives since then, and I had kind of forgotten about this. I knew I had it, but I had just kind of forgotten about it. I had gotten another Falcon, even the F1, the Tops Bob, which is, like I discussed a little bit, but it's kind of like a Scandi Vex. Had to sharpen those a couple times. Took my time with it, and really realized that, I don't need to do these huge, crazy movements in order to achieve the convex edge. I started to build a little confidence. I also, too, have a Jeff White English trade knife I got off Dave Canterbury's website, but that also is a convex, and got that, used it a few times, or actually used it quite a few times, had to sharpen it, but it was the same thing. I just really took my time with it, and it hit me. I'm like, okay, I can do this now. So I went back, like I said, about a week ago. I had removed enough material. I was getting pretty close. I spent, I would say, no less than an hour and a half, but probably between an hour and a half and 2 hours, using this stone. I actually used the coarser side, the 100 grit side, and I apexed. And it was even on both sides. Now, I'll show the knife. I had to do more than just that, because I had to really bring the knife in quite a bit. I got to a point where I had to start sharpening all the way up here so I could thin the entire blade out to get to the apex. And that took a lot of time and work. And, I joked in the previous video that, I think I've given myself carpal tunnel here. Worth it, because excuse me, I apologize for that. That was gross. But I've been able to fix it. And like I said, it took a lot of work. I had to literally reprofile the entire bottom half of the knife. And you can see now it has, like, a nice pretty polish on it. But it took a lot of work and time and frustration. A few times I had to just set the knife down, walk away for a couple minutes and be like, all right, I can do this. And boom. And it was tough for me because, doing, the V-edge knives, stuff like that, I have sharpened machetes, axes, tons of things. And, this is not bragging. It's just what it is. I can get hair shaving, whittling edges, and I'm having so much trouble with these convexes. But I just had to keep telling myself, all right, I can do it, whatever. Now, I would say when it comes to freehand sharpening in general, especially with the V edges, I would say, you know what? Yeah, I'm not an expert, but I think I'm pretty damn good at it. With the convex edges, I would say I'm pretty damn okay at it. Still have a ways to go, but I have given myself more confidence now because I understand better. And it took a lot of just me messing around and messing up to finally realize what it is I need to do in order to do that. And now, I mean, you can see, I'll try to... If you told me a year ago or a year and a half ago that I would be able to do that with this knife, I wouldn't have believed you. Now, what am I getting to with that? My long, boring story. Well, a couple things. One, I took too literally, because a lot of the videos talking about convexing were talking about using the hand motions. Now, maybe I'm just a moron, but I just didn't quite understand. I saw them discussing the motions of, lifting and lowering the blade, and took it literally that I need to do it that much. So maybe I'm just an idiot. That could be true. Probably is. Wouldn't be surprised. You ask my girl, she'll tell you, yeah. But a lot of it, too, was just I didn't have quite that full experience yet with the convex. Now, that also gets to that point of the S1. It's a $170 knife, and they make cheaper convex knives. I should have practiced on the Jeff White one. It was like a $40 knife, a beautiful knife. But if I had to ruin a knife, I'd rather ruin a $40 to $50 knife than a $170 knife. So that was a huge lesson learned right there. Now, getting into another lesson here, promise won't be quite as boring of a story or quite as long, but the first folding knife that really got me into carrying folding knives. I always carried them as a kid, but when I started getting into knives, I was really into fixed blades, and then I started thinking, I'm carrying kind of a cheap knife. I want a nicer folding knife, and I got this, the Ontario Rat 1. Now, I'll show you in a second, but I'm sure anybody who was watching that has Rat 1s can see this blade does not look like a Rat 1. This thing looks like a little cheese knife now. Now, to give you some comparison, this is your regular Rat 1. This is the D2 version, but the steel doesn't make a difference with what we're talking about here. And this is my Rat 1. This is not the same blade anymore. Now, this was a mistake in a different sense. This knife has always been very sharp. It's a US 8. It's very easy to sharpen. It requires more sharpening versus, say, the D2. But it's a very sharp knife. There's no doubting that. But the other mistake I had run into when I started sharpening, I didn't quite understand honing or stropping yet. I used strops, and I still do, and I very much advocate using strops, because once you get an edge that you like, short of, damaging the edge, nicks, rolls, what have you, you can use a strop with a little bit of compound, and you can bring your edge right back. And that's something I would do, but I would only do it after I would sharpen, make sure I got the burr removed, and, put a little extra polish on there. But that was it. Now, I just didn't quite understand at the time, but isn't that big of a deal. But the other thing, too, was every time I would sharpen this, I would start with not necessarily the lowest grit, but even the 220. Every time I would sharpen it, I would literally reprofile the knife, which isn't needed. What I do now, I strop, because, like I said, you can absolutely keep and maintain an edge for a very long time with a strop if you strop often. Not going to get into the whole with stropping techniques. From what I have noticed, I find it's best to just strop at a little bit of a lower angle. So if you say, for example, you're sharpening at this angle, you want to just lower it just a little bit, because the leather will conform to the edge. So if you're stropping at the angle, you can essentially convex the apex a bit, which is fine if that's what you're going for. But you can also round it off. Not really what I feel like most people are going for. But what I do now, and I've been doing for probably the last couple of years now. I've been sharpening about 3 years. So for the last couple of years, I have this stone. There's another cheap stone. It's called Anself, Anself, I believe. Get it on Amazon. It's made probably China somewhere. It's a 10,000 grit stone, and I genuinely believe it is. This is the finest of all my stones. It's a $10 or $12 stone. Ordered it. It actually took about 2 months to get here. I completely forgot it. Just one day I went and checked the mail. I'm like, oh wow, would you look at that? But I use this, or I'll use my 6,000 grit on my Kingstone. If it's a little past, like I said with the stropping, if you go a little too long before stropping, again, stropping will do so much. I feel like stropping will do 75 to 80% of your maintenance. After a while, if you either go too long between stropping, or if you're just doing a lot of hardcore use with it over a short period and go to strop it, it won't quite bring back that shaving edge. But stropping absolutely is capable of doing that. You can take a knife, use it, it won't be shaving anymore, fully sharpened, or fully sharp, if you will, and that strop will bring you right back to a shaving sharp edge. But it's important to strop while it's still sharp. If you take a dull knife, you can strop it for a month, and I feel like I can almost guarantee you will not get it sharp. I mean, if you want to sit there for a month straight and do it and prove me wrong, fine, more power to you. But what I do now, if there is no edge damage, I'll just take my finest stone, which will be this, or even the 6,000 grit, and I'll just give it a few passes. So I'm really more honing it. I'm not removing tons of material. I'm not reprofiling it. I already have the profile of the edge that I want. I'm just maintaining it. And generally, if I'm doing a mirror polish, I'll set this down on something and, I'll go through the whole process. But I actually really enjoy it. I'll just get it wet and, I'll just sit and, depending, I don't know, I'll just spend like 2 or 3 minutes. I really couldn't even tell you number of passes. It's just, and I'll just do single strokes back and forth. And then what's cool is, especially with these higher grit stones, I'll be able to tell, because I'll be like, all right, it's starting to shave a bit. And I'll know once I throw it on the strop, it'll take off any burr, clean everything up, and I'm back in action. You don't always need to reprofile or do a full sharpening. Now, what I will do, like I said, now I don't touch this unless I'm fixing a knife or resharpening. What I'll do, for example, say my work knife, the Benchmade Freak, which is the S30V, like I said, it doesn't really matter, I guess, the steel so much, but, I'll usually sharpen it maybe once a month. I'll strop it usually once a week, but once a month or so, especially too, I'll usually wind up nicking a couple of paint cans, opening the boxes or whatever. But so what I'll generally do is I'll start with, I have a 600 grit stone, spend a minute or two on that just until I get the apex, until I can feel the burr has folded over to the other side. And there are different ways you can check that. What I'll generally do is I'll hold the knife like this and I'll just use my fingernail and see if I can feel it catching. And it's good to check, because for as long as I've been sharpening, I still check it all the time. That's how I know I can now go to the other side, or I can progress to the next stone. Is just once I can feel that burr, and I'll go down the entire length of the blade. It just takes a few seconds, and to me, it's worth it, because if you don't end up apexing your side, it's not going to magically apex. The higher the grit you go, the smaller the burr generally you're going to have. And you'll just wind up having, it'll be really sharp, and then you'll have a little spot that's not so sharp, and then, the rest of it is sharp. But I think a 600 grit stone is good to work with. I think it's a good starting stone. I feel like a 600 grit and a 1000. I keep my work knife at a 1000 grit. I think a 1000 grit is a perfect working edge, in the sense that at 1000 grit you can get a nice beautiful shaving edge, but I think that's just the perfect, my EDC knives, I'll throw the mirrors on them, like I said, the flexing, but my work knives and just most of my fixed blades and stuff that I use in general, I'll just keep them at 1000 grit. Sometimes if I'm being daring, I'll bring it up to 2, or whatever. Sometimes I'll throw it on the 6 just for fun, but generally a 1-2000 grit I think is perfect. You got a good polish, you got it nice and sharp, and the thing will cut and cut and cut. So a 600 grit, even a 400, even more so, but a 600 grit I find to be a perfect stone. If you have minor chips and rolls, it will take them out relatively quickly. I mean, I guess you could theoretically use any stone. It's just the higher the grit, the longer it's going to take. I feel like once you get past the 1-2000 grit, 3000 and up, you're really not even so much sharpening anymore. You're really just polishing the edge. Now, that's a whole other thing there, but that's why I think a 1000 grit, if you're just going to have two stones, or if you're going to get a combo stone, if you get a 400 1000 or 600 1000, whatever variation, I think you're set to go. What I would really recommend is the Smith's Tri-Hone Sharpener or Tri-Stone Sharpener. I do have a video on it, but it's a coarse, medium, and fine. The coarse, I believe, I think it's about 240 grit, 240 to 300 grit. Then the medium is a 600, and then the finishing stone, your fine, is a 1000. And that 1000 stone is a beast. That thing, I have put so many knives on, that stone is not worn a bit. Now, there are benefits, pros, and cons with, higher wearing and lower wearing stones. The higher wearing stones, yeah, they'll wear out faster, but unless you're sharpening a bunch of knives every single day, it's going to last you a long time. And there are benefits to the stone wearing a bit. It's wearing, and it's giving you fresh material for you to sharpen on. Now, the lower wearing stones, like that Smith's 1000 on the Tri-Hone Sharpener, that thing has not budged. And it's great because you can use a good amount of force. You don't really have to worry about damaging the stone. But it does tend to clog up a little bit. I have one of those little King Nagura stones to help clean it. And, a lot of times I'll use a little bit of soap mixed with the water. They are said to be more of an oil stone. I don't generally use oil. I like using water better. But on those stones, especially the 1000, I'll just use a little bit of dish soap mixed in, and it really alleviates. It works a lot better than just water, in my experience. And that little Nagura stone helps clean it up. So, maybe between knives or whatever, I'll do a quick cleanup on it, and I'm back in action. Now, what I find to work well is going from there and going right to stropping. And even that 400 grit, I rarely use it. Whatever it is, the 300, 240, it's lower than the 600. The coarse stone, I don't really use it that often. Partly is because I have this Smith stone, and I do my reprofiling and edge repair, if you will, on that. But that system is $25, and that will cover, I will say for the average person, it will cover all your sharpening needs. Now, there are a lot of things, like I said, there are a lot of things you can go down the rabbit hole. And, like I had said, I would recommend sticking with the factory edge. Once you get good with that, then if you want to start going nuts and experimenting, because generally I like my edges to be thinner versus wider, but there are the pros and cons to that. I like them thinner, they slice better. I like that look, especially, for me, I do like the mirrors. You can see more of it. Excuse me. But they are a little more fragile. Now, depending on the steels you're using, like higher-end steels, tougher steels, you don't have to worry about it quite as much as using lower-end or softer steels. But when you have the wider edges, they won't slice quite as well as your thinner edges, but they're a lot more durable. Now, a good way I feel like I can explain that comes to, if you look at most people, your average person, kitchen knives. Those knives are very, very thin. I mean, you can have a relatively just straight dull kitchen knife, but because it's so thin, it will continue cutting. You have to use more force, and it's more effort, but you'll still be able to, cut your carrots and what have you. I find the same to be true with, that's why I like the edges, the thinner edges, on my knives generally, because it allows them to slice a lot better. I do a lot of food prep with my EDC knives, so it tends to be more beneficial. But also, I do a lot of work, around the house, on cars and stuff, cutting zip ties, cardboard, anything. And those thinner edges, especially because the knives I carry usually are higher end steel, so they can handle a little more abuse. When I was carrying this all the time, the AUS 8, yeah, we'll cut through zip ties, absolutely, but cut 4 or 5 zip ties, and the thing is getting ready to think about sharpening soon, or at the very least stropping. There are a lot of things that you can go into, and I will do more videos on this topic because there are a lot of things I think people should think about when it comes to sharpening, but I don't think you should let yourself get overwhelmed, because for me, one of the biggest things I had to tell myself was my biggest competition is myself. Because, yeah, you know what, there are people that they sharpen a lot better than I do, and that's fine. I will eventually get there. I'm still learning. But once I got that first shaving edge, it was amazing. And what made me realize that I've actually had gotten good with sharpening was the first time I got a shaving edge, my girl thought it was the coolest thing. And she's not into knives, but she was like, wow, that's really cool, babe. Like, she was really impressed. Now, when I show her shaving, like me shaving hair with the knife, she doesn't care. It's boring. It doesn't mean anything to her now. And that's what made me realize. I'm like, wow. Oh, and I've told her that too. I'm like, your indifference to my good edges is because you're bored with them. It's nothing new. And that's what, for me, gave me that realization. Now, I do not have any illusions. I know there is still room for improvement. There are a lot of ways I can get better, and a lot of it is just practice. And also having tons of different knives and different steels, I feel like has really helped, because all steels, they all perform and act a little bit differently. But another thing too is, when I first started, there were some knives that I had that had the higher end steels. I remember before the first time I sharpened CPM 3V, I was really nervous because I always hear, oh, it's hard to sharpen. Or the same when, I have the Endura 4 and ZDP 189. It's hard to sharpen. It's not. No steel is harder or easier to sharpen. It's just some steels will take longer to sharpen, if that makes sense. So, just for a wild range example, ZDP 189 is no more difficult to sharpen than AUS 8. ZDP 189 takes a significantly longer amount of time to sharpen than AUS 8. From start to finish, say even if I start on, say, the 220 and work up to, I don't know, say I'll work up to a 2000 grit, probably 5-6 minutes. That ZDP 189, starting with the 220 up to, say, a 2 or 3000 grit. Oh boy, I don't know. But over 20, say about 20 minutes, probably a little more, depending. The other thing is too is I'm not in a rush when I'm sharpening, and that's the thing too is you don't want to rush when you are sharpening. Take your time. Just you want to be chill, relax. I like to sharpen when everything is just relaxed. For me, it's very cathartic. For me, it's a form of meditation, if you will. I don't meditate, but the closest thing I can attribute to what meditation might be like is sharpening. It's very zen. But you want to relax. You enjoy it, now sometimes, because I am a lot more comfortable with it, sometimes like, all right, whatever, I'll just sharpen this real quick, throw an edge on it, boom, good to go out the door. And that's fine. But when I first started sharpening, I felt like I was in a rush. I got to get this done. And that's when I started running into problems, But there are many things to consider, and I'm sure there are things. Before I did this, I showered before this, and I was thinking I made a list in my head, all the things I want to talk about. I should have written them down, and I want to start writing down. I'm sure there are things that I missed that I do want to go into more with the sharpening tips or advice, but it just means I have an excuse to do another one of these videos, and I do really want to do a tutorial. It'll probably be a very long video, so for you fans that enjoy the longer videos, that'll be a good one. This is turning into one coming up on 35 minutes. But it basically, for me, comes down to take your time, relax, and try not to let yourself be overwhelmed. A good way I can kind of compare it to is driving. When you first start driving, you're not immediately, I guess that it's recommended, but you're not immediately, doing donuts and racing your buddies down the street and everything. I mean, you can, yeah, go on and get yourself killed, but once you learn those basics and you feel comfortable, you know how to handle the vehicle, the steering, how it feels, what to expect. Same thing with sharpening. Then once you get more comfortable with the vehicle or the sharpening, then you can start going nuts with the, like, all right, yeah, let's bring the angle in, because I think that's a good thing. You should experiment. And that's how I found out I like narrower edges. I don't right now have a method of really measuring what my edges are. I really don't know. I just bring them in a little bit, use it for a bit, see how I like it, bring it in a little more. I always keep going until I'm like, all right, that's what I'm going for. I have seen you can get some of those little cards where you just kind of put the knife in, and whichever little notch it fits in, it'll tell you if it's, 17 degrees, 20 degrees, whatever degrees. Which actually will be good, because at some point I do want to start doing, like, really getting into and doing steel testing between the different steels. Very similar to anybody. If you don't watch, I really highly cannot recommend enough Pete over at Cedric and Ada. He is an amazing guy. I've talked to him a couple times in comments and stuff, and on YouTube. He does some live videos sometimes. He is an awesome, awesome guy. But he does these great steel tests with rope cutting, where he will set the same angle on a knife, cut the same material, and just has this whole numerical value system that he attributes to each steel. And then he goes nuts and he tries different angles, and I can't explain it and do it justice the way he can. But I really would recommend checking out Pete over at Cedric and Ada. If for no other reason than his videos are just super entertaining. He has tons of funny videos. The guy is hilarious. And how the guy doesn't have 50 million subscribers, I don't understand. He is just so great. I just think more people just check him out. But anyway, now it's getting about time I should start wrapping up. Gotta get the kiddos ready for bed. But just remember, it takes time. Slow and steady wins the race. You can do it. I look at it, if I did it, if I can do it, anybody can sharpen. Think of it like in Ratatouille, that old chef that dies or whatever, that anybody can cook, anybody can sharpen. You can absolutely do it. Take your time, find some good resources. Don't overwhelm yourself with this method, that method. Because even, my techniques, because I do a lot of when I'm starting on a particular stone, I do the back and forth, get the belly, the tip a little bit, back and forth. But then to finish it, you'll look at the edge and you'll see, it'll look not wavy, but it just will have random markings on it. So then I'll smooth it out. Then I'll do some arbitrary number. I'll do 10 times one side, flip it over 10 times the other, and just work down until I'm just doing, 1 and 1. Till I feel like, yes, I like how this looks, I'll go to the next stone. But some people will just they'll do, 50 times on each side and work their way down, go to the next stone. But just remember, check your burrs. Before you go to your other stone, remember to strop. Remember, you do not always have to reprofile or do a full sharpening from the coarsest stone up to the finest stone. Like I said, I'll use the 10,000, but it's just because I like the stone. I like using it. If you sharpen up to 1,000 grit, throw it on the 1,000 stone. Try it that way. If your stropping isn't quite bringing it to the shaving or the degree of sharpness you want, try 5 passes on each side. Just 5. Strop it and check it. You want it to be a little sharper? Do another 5. Just keep doing it. You will get to where you want, and then you'll know. You'll be able to read and understand, and it's cool. You'll get to a point where you can kind of feel the edge, because that's one of the things, too, is you just kind of feel, you'll get a good idea. Yeah, that's probably going to shave, and then, oh, look, it does. There are a lot of things you can do, but like I said, it's as simple or as complicated as you make it. I would say start simple, then you can go into the complicated. But anyway, You guys, please have a great rest of your night. I really hope this was informational and helpful. If there's anything you agree, disagree with, or your own experiences, please let me know in the comments. I would really love to just have a discussion. Like I said, whether you agree or not, that's absolutely fine. That's how I learn. I feel like that's how people learn. If everybody did the same thing, it would be moot. It would be boring. You know, I would love to hear your experiences. You guys have a great night. Remember to keep carving, stay sharp, and remember to like, comment, subscribe, share. Check out Instagram, Gnarly Knives. You guys have a good one. Peace.